Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Beat Kümin from the Global Research Priority on Food at the University of Warwick. This is a contribution to week 6 of our feast theme for the Resonate Festival for Coventry, UK City of Culture, which is dedicated to drinks, hence the little attribute here beside me. I'm delighted to have Susan Flavin from Trinity College Dublin here with me, an expert on Irish foodways in the early modern period and PI of the Food Cult ERC project based at the same institution.
Hi, thanks for the invite.
For a start then, did early modern people drink fermented beverages because the water was so bad?
It's a myth that's been perpetuated through time. I think you'll agree. It stems from a misunderstanding of what bad means in terms of foods in the early modern period. And when early modern period say that water is bad, they mean humourly it's bad. So it's a cold drink that can upset your constitution. It's a really different way of thinking about how food impacts your body. And beer, on the other hand, was a temperate drink, a sort of a warmer drink and nutritionally more balanced. So beer was good for you in that sense, because they didn't understand microbes or badness the way that we do. But of course, beer was also nutritionally very, very good. So it's a form of liquid calories for hard work. Yeah. So there were other reasons to drink it too.
And I always thought it was sort of slightly maybe a projection back from industrial period, you know, when you have pollution and all sorts of extreme kind of mechanized kind of processing, whereas in the early modern period, most people lived in the countryside. I think they had access to sort of purer sources, etc. So also from that point of view, I think it's just something that I think we should start, you know, really, really questioning.
Thinking about exactly, and most directions for brewing recommend that you use clean water or spring water to brew anyway. And as you say, if you've got fresh water for brewing, then you have fresh water for drinking. So yeah, it's one of those myths that's quite hard to shake, really.
I'm glad we got that out here now. Excellent. But why should we try to replicate historic beers? Is that a little bit of a fad?
It took some convincing to get the ERC to eyebrows were raised when I said we wanted to brew some beer. But I think it's very important because we know a lot as historians about how much people drank in this period, and consumption could be very high, and it was treated exactly like any other food. So in some of the records that we've seen, as much is spent on bread as it is on beer. Because people drink, a soldier, for example, would have a ration of 8 pints of beer a day, a household servant maybe 5 pints, a quarry worker, a stonemason, as the records that we're looking at, maybe 10 to 14 pints a day. And given that it's such a huge part of the calorific intake, it's very important to know what that means in nutritional terms. And unfortunately, as historians working on just records that tell us how much grain goes into a pint of beer, we can't get at that information. We need to brew it and understand all of the process to really understand what this means.
So I guess it was also a fun thing to do, yeah? Apart from all the
I won't lie, it was fun. It was very, very, a lot more challenging than I had anticipated it would be. And I went into it with a lot of naivety, but in the end, it was a lot of fun.
Okay. And how did you go about it? I mean, I find that very difficult to start from. You know, where do you find information about ingredients, recipe techniques? What kind of sources do we have for that?
Well, one of the images that we look at later, the household account, I guess that's where we started. We I suppose as historians, we're very lucky for this period in that we know a lot about what these beers were made of, because there are a lot of processes involved and there's a lot of money spent on ingredients, and all of that leaves a written record for us. So we have quite detailed records for certain institutions in terms of how much grain was used, what types of grain, how that changes over different periods and seasons, and how much beer is produced from that, which gives us quite a lot to go on as a start, and the different kinds of beers that are produced and things like that. And from that, then it was a matter of replicating that, trying to then produce the equipment and gather the most appropriate ingredients to try and make that beer.
But in history, nothing is ever stable. So how can you know that something that is mentioned in a 16th century source is vaguely comparable to what we have nowadays? So how do you go about finding the requisite barley or hops or even hardware?
Well, that was very challenging, and we tried. So we knew that we needed 50% oats and 50% barley for ours to start with the grains. It's for very heavily oat-based beer, and to start with the barley, we knew from the records that they were using a type of barley called bear barley, and we also know that in historic periods, barley was very different to what it's like now. So we now eat a very sort of commercialized, hybridized barley, whereas barleys in the past, or pure barleys, were very different. So they were very locally distinct. They were preserved year after year by individual farmers based on their own growing conditions and so on. And they look very different. They're very, very tall. They fall over in the wind. They've got small grains. And where they've been used to make beer, the beer is different. It doesn't produce as much sugar. It's lower in alcohol. And so we wanted to get as close as we could to that grain. And so because they're not produced commercially very much anymore, we were limited in that we could only source it from Orkney, which preserves bear barley now. So we worked with the Agronomy Institute there to source barley to make beer. And we had very little luck, on the other hand, with oats, because there aren't any landrace oats commercially available. So we tried to grow our own. That's why it took us 3 years to get there. But we didn't produce something that could make malt. So again, I think there's room for more work down the line on that.
So there is even scope to, I mean, go it on a massive scale and start, 10 years before the experiment, growing some new crops, etc. So that would be, something that might be done in the future.
Yeah, I think sometimes the research just hasn't been done on them. There's just very, very little research on oats. So you might find a seed bank has, a tiny quantity of seed available, and they think it's a landrace oat, but nobody knows where it came from.
Okay.
So it might just be more work than it's worth, really.
Okay. So let's assume you've got a bit of an information on the technique and the method. You've got some of the ingredients together, but how did it actually go in practice? It's one thing is I would like to do that. The other thing is I'm doing it. So tell us, how did that go?
Well, it took a long time to I suppose, we used, you talked about sources. We used things like woodcut images, descriptions in brewers' manuals, and then tried to recreate a brew house. So we had to gather together lots of artisans, and people with skills that are really dying out. And that took us around Europe, really. So we went to Portugal to get a copper made, a big copper to boil the water. We worked with Cooper in Liverpool to make the oak casks and the mash tun, a wicker worker who designed the filtration system, and then people with experience of historic brewing. And we had to piece all that together, and that took a very long time. And there were all sorts of challenges in terms of just getting these things together. The hops, hot weather over the last few years has caused heritage varieties of hops to die. They don't grow. So we lost one batch. One batch got accidentally posted to the wrong address and was going around in the mail system for a week, which caused a lot of anxiety on my end. And then, of course, the oats wouldn't make malt, and there were lots of challenges. We had a microbiologist in Cork grow some yeast from a yeast bank, which was very exciting. And that exploded in the post as well. So by the time it arrived, we had half of the yeast. So it was kind of a lot of problems, but we got there in the end.
Fantastic. And so where did you do the actual malting and brewing? Did you do that in Dublin, or where did you do that?
No, so there were logistical issues with that. We wanted to make malt as close as we could to the traditional type of malting technique, but we didn't build a malt house, and that would be a different project again. So we worked with Warminster Maltings, which is a traditional malt house that still uses very old methods. So they germinate on a wooden floor and turn their malt manually, and so we sent our bear barley to them, and they malted it for us, and then brought it to the museum, and then we milled it on site using hand quernstones to sort of keep consistency there. And we did all the actual brewing at the Weald Downland Museum in Sussex, who allowed us to turn their Tudor kitchen into a brew house for a couple of weeks, and that was absolutely fantastic, a great experience, really.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of traveling in your research, or is that just my impression?
I think it was just for this particular project. I was really fortunate to go to Orkney, which was very, very exciting to see the barley. And because we've been making a documentary about this whole process, we brought a film crew to all of these venues as well. So we'll be able to sort of show the whole process from manuscript to cup at the end.
Okay. And since you're mentioning showing things, maybe that's a good moment here to share the screen and maybe have a little bit more information on some of the things that you already talked about a little bit. So can you maybe just talk us through a little bit of some of these slides that you provided for us?
So we talked about how, as a historian, you might get information on what these beers contained. And this is from a household account from Dublin Castle in 1574. And it's got, you can see right in the middle, it's got a summary of the buttery account. And this one tells you, it's an example of what we work from. So it tells you how much beer is produced, whether it's a strong beer or an ordinary beer, and exactly how much of different types of grain were used and the volume produced and what that cost. And that gives you an idea, I guess, of the levels of detail that we do have for this type of consumption or production.
But probably it's fair to say that most of these sources will come from relatively prosperous elite kind of people, or did you, I mean, it's probably unrealistic to expect a brewer to keep records like that at the time, is it?
Yeah, I mean, they're hit and miss. This one is from an elite establishment, but we were much more interested in what ordinary people were drinking. And so we deliberately chose from this to make an ordinary beer, not the strong beer, because we know, again, from these records that the strong beer is not, it's produced, it's only about 13% of what's produced. So we went for one that was what the household servants would have been consuming, not what the elites were consuming. And that was important. But I would say we would then end up with a very good quality ordinary beer as opposed to something, you know, something of less quality.
Okay. Then what do we have to think about?
Oh, this is lovely, isn't it? It doesn't look like this now. This was before it got a lot of heavy use. It was quite gleaming and coppery. This is the copper. People had, you know, everyone that's brewing needs this because this is where you boil the water, basically. And this was made by a coppersmith in Portugal, and sent over to us. And Adrian Worrell made the stand that it's on there, and this gets a lot of use. It's the fire is lit at about 8 o'clock every morning, and this then bubbles away throughout the day to produce the hot water that goes into the grain to make the beer. And this was, in social terms, these are very interesting because we find them in wills and inventories as historians all the time because they're incredibly expensive and they're passed down through generations and really maintained and repaired, and they're quite an important asset to have in your house. This kind of brewing hardware in this period.
Okay. Then a whole room full of
that's a lot of vessels. That's nice because you can see some of the 16th century earthenware in the background as well. So I guess if you start at the fire, you can see the copper bubbling away, and then directly in front of that is the mash tun. So that's probably where most of the action happens, really. So that's a big oak tun, and then people used a top mashing system in the 16th century. So the water will come from that copper and be poured in with the grain to the top of this mash tun. And then at the very bottom, there's a tube tap mechanism with a little wicker filter behind it that we designed based on visual sources. And then the water and the grain sit in there for an hour and a half, and then the wort is run off through the bottom and kept aside. And then we do that again because we're making an ordinary beer. And then those two are mixed together and boiled again in that vessel with the hops. And then they're removed to the other side of the brew house here into one of these vessels where it comes down to room temperature, and then the yeast is added. And then it sits in a cask for about 7 days fermenting, and then it's ready for tunning.
Would that have been women doing this, do you think? Because we often read about alewives. So what's the gender sort of aspect of this?
Yeah, in these big institutions like the ones that we're using, it would be male. But traditionally in the Middle Ages, women had a huge role to play in brewing. And the argument is that changed in the sort of the later 16th century when brewing became more commercialized. And the argument is that women became pushed out of that industry because of the introduction of hops and things like that.
One thing we're doing for Feast is a church ale, you know, with a parish partnership at Berkswell. And so I imagine that possibly in the 15th century, the women of the parish would have used the church house, which might have looked possibly a little bit like that in one of the corners. So do you think that's just an illusion, or something like that is actually what might have happened in these small places in England?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this isn't a big commercial brewery. This is an actual kitchen from a 16th century Tudor house that we just, you know, used and put our brewing equipment in. But this equipment is quite standard through time. Little bits change, like the type of filtration system on the mash tun there, but most of this equipment is quite standard through time. So I expect it would have looked very, very like this. If you can see there, behind the tun, can you see the hourglass?
Yeah.
If you look from the window, it's behind that ladle. That was recreated to keep time during the period, because we didn't know if there was a clock and that. So I think every detail was accounted for. But I expect that your brew house would look very similar. And actually, you can see, if you just look behind the mash tun there, you can see the bushel, which is the standard vessel used for weighing grain in that period. So you definitely have had one of those as well.
Okay. And you've since transferred all these items to your own kitchen, is that?
No, my husband wouldn't let me bring them home.
Oh, I see. Okay.
no, these stay at the museum, and they will be used for the visitors and for the public and for more brewing experiments through time. So they'll have a long life. And get lots of use.
Good. And then we got a rather different picture here.
Oh yes, so this is hops, and hops were introduced probably from the early 16th century. They started to become more common in beer. In Ireland, definitely from the sort of middle of the 16th century, you start to see them being used. It's a bittering agent, and it's introduced. It's a Dutch innovation. And it's important because it's been sort of argued that hops heralds the commercialization of beer and the sort of upscaling of brewing. The reason being that hops mean hopping beer makes beer last longer, so you can produce more, you can move more around and so on. And the beer that we're making is definitely hopped. But the problem for us was trying to find an appropriate type of hop to use, because as you can see in the document underneath, we don't have very much information. We only know that in this case that we needed Flemish hops. And so we worked with Peter Darby in the photograph there, who's at the Hops Association, to try and identify what was as close as possible to this type of hop. Flemish red vines were the earliest introduced hops to England, and we know that it's imported to Ireland. And so this particular hop is called Tolhurst. And it's a very, very old type of hop, and as close as we could get to the characteristics of a Flemish red vine. And this, the day before we brewed, we're actually harvesting it with him at the National Hops Collection.
Fantastic. And you imagine that something like that would have gone on all across Europe, or were there massive regional variations in how people went about brewing, or is that the subject of another project?
There's massive regional variations. I think that the brewing process itself is probably not all that different, but there's a lot of variation in terms of what types of beer and how much grain people are using, and the quality of brewing. Obviously, that would vary everywhere. And there's a lot of variation in terms of, obviously, things like we can't control. You know, one day we had a 28-degree temperature, and the beer turned into porridge in the mash tun, and we got no beer at all. And I suppose those are the kinds of variations that would happen all the time. It's very difficult to control all of the circumstances. So the whole process is very variable.
So a consumer who would have gone to a 16th century alehouse wouldn't have had the security, I get my Corona or whatever it may be, and it tastes exactly like that. So it would have been almost exciting to go in and see what the beer tastes like today.
Exciting or disappointing, I suppose, because it doesn't take very much for it to go off. And you know, one of the beers that we made, it was a control. So we made a modern beer using modern ingredients but old period equipment, and it just died. It didn't ferment at all, and that was because, of course, the vessels are open to bacteria and everything, and we used a more modern yeast, and the yeast doesn't seem to be able to cope with the conditions, so the beer died. It didn't ferment quickly enough, and these are the things that would happen all the time. So you could get a sour beer, or if it was kept too long, it might go off and taste a bit vinegary, or So very variable.
Fascinating. Good. And then here, what have we got here?
Well, these are our three brewers. Mark Meltonville's a food historian. Mark on my right there with the baseball cap on. He's our brewer in chief, really, and he directed everything, and he was responsible for sourcing this equipment and working with different artisan makers and everything. Charlie Taverner's our postdoctoral researcher, and now an expert brewer. He's him learning the trade. And Adrian Worrell works with Mark a lot. Adrian does a lot of historical reenactment and recreation, and has a lot of experience in. He makes things. He can just go out and whittle a paddle for you if you ask him to. It's incredible skill. And so he worked with us all the way through this. So there's our three brewers in action, really.
Did you have an audience for that, or was that behind closed doors?
That was, people were coming and going, but not allowed into the kitchen while we were brewing, because there's a lot of open fire and very hot water moving around all the time,
For modern health and safety for you.
Exactly.
Okay, and this is, I think, if people obviously are interested in what you're doing, you do many more other things than just brewing. So that's the homepage of the project. And then, am I right? This is an online exhibition specifically on the brewing, yeah?
Yes, it's a very simple exhibition, and it gives you links to more papers, and people will be able to follow the results, because the results are starting to come into us now. So we'll be updating those results if people are interested in what all this beer means in nutritional terms. We'll be able to update them there.
Great. Okay, then maybe if we come back then to the other screen. Some big and difficult questions now. Did it actually taste any good?
It tasted. It's very, very light. It kind of like a very light straw color. The oat one. The oat beer looked cloudier than the one we did with just pure barley, and that was interesting to us because we have a lot of descriptions about Irish beer in this period that the English thought looked very muddy. Was the description, and not very nice. And we can see from that actually that it probably did look different to what they were used to. And it tasted, people that tasted it said it tasted quite fruity, almost like a cider, but very, very drinkable, very light, and very good for quenching thirst,
Oh, refreshing. What they would have been looking for,
Yeah.
Do I sense that you didn't taste it yourself?
Oh, I got a terrible cold. Just the day I think it was that I'm not built for the hard work of a Tudor brew alewife. So I think I lost my sense of taste, and it was sitting in the fridge and I couldn't taste it, so it went off. But I hope I'll have another opportunity to taste it.
And how strong did it come out in terms of alcohol content? That's one of the big questions that we're always wondering about, because people drink so much in terms of volume. So how strong was it, you think?
Well, this one, we did 3 runs of this. One of them came back very low, but the two of the Dublin Castle beers came back at 4.5 and 5%. But we're still running tests on those, so we're going to do it again now, all the same analysis, because we think there's some secondary fermentation. So if it's sitting around a while, it continues to ferment. So we might get a higher level of alcohol. But in other words, it wasn't the 2% that people think it was. It was definitely much more in line with a modern beer.
Even for the common people, you think? Okay.
Yeah, definitely for workers. Yeah.
So that suggests that given the volumes we know some of them consume, they must have had a better way of coping with such high alcohol content. What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I suppose if you drink a lot over time, you develop a tolerance to it. It's a very, very interesting question, though. If people were, slightly inebriated all the time, we're
because
hoping,
these people were paid in beer partly, weren't they? That some of the wages were paid in beer, and so you imagine they were actually on the job, weren't they?
Yeah, there's an obligation if you're if you're an employer, that you'll pay in some beer. It's expected, and some good quality beer as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it's an interesting question, really.
And now you've got these results and you keep getting results. So where can people find out more about this virtual exhibition? And presumably there will be some publications and a film, you say?
Yeah, the film, we finished shooting the film in January, and hopefully by the spring, summer, that will be available. And there'll be links to that on our website. And then we're working, because this is a huge interdisciplinary effort, we're working with microbiologists, food scientists, now a dietitian and nutritional expert, and we'll all be bringing our expertise together to write a paper that explores what beer means as food in this period.
Fantastic. Well, I guess that's all that we have time for, but many thanks for sharing this exciting work with us, Susan, and good luck with the big project and the film and everything. And thanks to everybody who's been watching. Hope you enjoy our feast coverage, and please check the website for other events and content. So thank you very much, and goodbye.